All rise for the Honorable Judge.
You may be seated. The following is the trial of Vern Ehlers. It is a mock trial. As such, the proceedings enacted here should not be misconstrued to represent an actual trial, nor should they be thought to illustrate the full complexities of due process under constitutional and international law. My jurisdiction is limited to the confines of your television and your conscience. I am not a real judge, though I am playing one on TV. Likewise, those involved in these proceedings are portraying the roles of expert witnesses, reporters, and various other persons. Some performers are playing real people. Others speak with a combination of voices. In the absence of actual legal proceedings indicting United States lawmakers for their support of an illegal war with Iraq, we are creating a fictional one. However, the voices and the stories you will hear are true. Those involved in this teleplay have done their best to document all claims made herein. Source materials are available upon request. Is the accused present?
The accused is not present.
The accused was subpoenaed, was he not?
He was. However, today he is spending time with his family. He cites job stress and said he needs some downtime.
Did he understand that he is charged with crimes against humanity?
I'm not sure. I only spoke to a staff person. She was very nice, though, and thanked me for calling.
For the record, we are both referring to Congressman Vern Ehlers of Michigan's 3rd District.
Yes.
And for the record, this is the same Congressman Ehlers that swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America?
Yes.
Well, that puts a damper on our proceedings.
He has sent along a videotape, though.
Oh?
Yes, it's only a still image, but Mr. Ehlers hopes that it will suffice. He, or at least his staff in his office, sends regards.
Well, I guess we can proceed. Let it enter the court record that the defendant chose to represent himself without legal counsel. The charges being brought against Mr. Ehlers are as follows. Congressman Vern Ehlers, you are being charged in the high courts with willfully and intentionally violating the Charter of the United Nations, the International Declaration of Human Rights, the principles of international law as put forward by the Nuremberg Tribunal and the Geneva Conventions, as well as the Constitution of the United States of America. How does the accused wish to plead? Let it be entered into the court record that the accused, Mr. Vern Ehlers, remained silent. The prosecution may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would also like to have the following entered into the court record. This is a trial by jury. At the end of this court session, those here in the courtroom audience will be asked to make a determination of the guilt or innocence of Congressman Vern Ehlers. Those of you watching the proceedings from home will be asked to take a position on the ideas and issues presented here today. The case against Mr. Ehlers will be presented in 2 parts. First, the prosecution will argue that Mr. Ehlers, in his support of the Bush administration's push toward war with Iraq, has violated both international and constitutional law. Second, the prosecution will make clear to the jury the humanitarian consequences of such an action. This will serve to highlight Mr. Ehlers' complicity in crimes against humanity. The prosecution would like to call our first witness. Will Miss Geneva Brown please take the stand?
Ms. Brown, I remind you that you are under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Brown, you have been called into court today because of your expertise in international and constitutional law. In October of 2002, the defendant, Representative Vern Ehlers, voted in support of the resolution granting President George W. Bush the authority to use military force against Iraq. This resolution gave President Bush the authority to attack Iraq regardless of whether or not the UN Security Council approved of it or not. Does this act by Mr. Ehlers violate international law?
Well, that depends on a couple of things. According to Articles 41 and 42 of the UN Charter, no member state that has the right to enforce any resolution with armed force unless the Security Council decides there has been a breach of its resolution. The Security Council also needs to determine that all non-military means of enforcement have been exhausted. At that point, the Council must specifically authorize the use of military force.
And did the Security Council authorize such use of force?
They did not.
Therefore, Representative Ehlers' support of the war on Iraq came without the approval of the UN Security Council. Is this a violation of the UN Charter you just referred to, Articles 41 and 42?
Yes.
And does the UN Charter allow for any exceptions to the use of force?
The Charter states that a member state can act in individual or collective self-defense.
Could it therefore be said that the recent US-led attack against Iraq is defendable by this clause?
No. Iraq has not attacked this country or any other country in 11 years. None of Iraq's neighbors have appealed to the Security Council to protect them from imminent attack by Iraq. The UN Charter makes it very clear that a preemptive attack is not self-defense if there is no imminent threat.
I want to now turn to the matter of the US Constitution. Is it defensible to say that Mr. Ehlers, in voting to support this war, that it violates international law, that this war that violates international law, he was actually acting to protect American interests and fulfill his duties as put forward in the US Constitution?
No. The UN Charter is a treaty that the US Congress has authorized. According to Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, and I quote, "All treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land." By violating the UN Charter, the Bush administration, and in this particular case, Mr. Ehlers, has violated the US Constitution.
The Constitution requires that all the terms of all treaties entered into are to be obeyed.
That's correct.
But what if Representative Ehlers felt it was important to support the President's decision because he's the Commander-in-Chief?
The decision of whether or not to go to war is not the President's to make. Regardless of the fact that the executive is Commander-in-Chief, the Constitution clearly states in Article 1, Section 8, that only Congress has the power to declare war. The Congress did not declare war.
And yet Congress did nothing when the Bush administration started the war in Iraq without a formal declaration. I point out to the jury that Congress abdicated their power to decide on going to war to the executive branch, a clear violation of each congressperson's duty, including Mr. Ehlers, as laid out in the US Constitution. In fairness, I would like to take one more approach, Ms. Brown. Let me point out the fact that Representative Ehlers and the President are in the same party. By supporting the President's drive toward war, it could be said that Mr. Ehlers was simply following the party line. Certainly he can't be held accountable. He was simply following orders. Is there a legal precedent in international law?
Yes, we find a suitable example in international law. According to the Nuremberg Tribunal number 82, Principle 4, the fact that a person acted pursuant to order of his government or of a superior does not relieve him from responsibility under international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible to him.
The prosecution suggests that Mr. Ehlers indeed had a moral choice available. Instead, he followed the party line in violation of the Constitution and international law. Thank you, Ms. Brown. No more questions, Your Honor.
In absence of an attorney for cross-examination, we shall proceed. Mr. Prosecutor.
Thank you, Your Honor. After making it clear that Mr. Ehlers has failed to uphold the US Constitution and the international laws which are included therein under Article 6, Clause 2, the prosecution now turns to the humanitarian consequences of this illegal action against Iraq. I must ask the jury and all present in this court to steel themselves. The accounts you are about to hear are, at times, undeniably horrific. However, it is important to hear these stories to be able to fully understand the human ramifications of Mr. Ehlers' support of this flight to war. The poor living standards and disease amplified by Ehlers' supported sanctions before the war is compounded by the injuries, illness, and deaths of civilians caused by the war, especially from US forces. These represent crimes against humanity. I first turn your attention to hard numbers. Our relationship to numbers is such that we don't have to get personal. They are, after all, only statistics. I submit to the court record information regarding the Iraq body count. This information is readily available on the internet. Iraq body count is a human security project to establish an independent and comprehensive public database of media-reported civilian deaths in Iraq resulting directly from military actions by the U.S. and its allies in 2003. Casualty figures are derived from a comprehensive survey of online media reports. Where these sources report differing figures, the range are given. All results are independently reviewed and error-checked by at least 3 members of the Iraq body count team before publication. The methodology, based on earlier work by Professor Mark Harold in producing a list of civilian deaths in the war on Afghanistan, makes it clear that the list is both accurate and verifiable. These numbers represent deaths that the accused is charged to be complicit with because of his support on the U.S. war on Iraq. As of today, May 3rd, 2003, the minimum number of civilian deaths in Iraq is 2,197. The maximum number is 2,670. And I submit this as evidence to the proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Prosecutor. I remind you, in the interest of time, to please keep your following comments brief. Continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. The prosecution will call its final witnesses momentarily. First, I wish to point out to the jury that the stories you hear may be new to you. It is possible that they were either willfully withheld from you somehow, or perhaps not considered newsworthy, or even presented a conflict of interest with the media corporations. Advertisers, after all, do not wish to follow up images of headless children with sales for soda pop. But it seems that they are okay with armless ones tucked away safely in American medical care. I turn to a statement submitted by Professor Harold in support of Iraq body count. The counting of civilian dead looms ever more importantly for at least 2 reasons. Military sources and their corporate mainstream media backers seek to portray the advent of precision-guided weaponry as inflicting at most minor incidental civilian casualties, when the reality of the situation is certainly not the case. The major source of opposition to these modern wars remains an informed, articulate general public, which retains a commitment to international humanitarian covenants of war at a time when most organized bodies and so-called experts have walked away from them. In the service of maintaining an informed, articulate general public, the prosecution calls Miss Kathy Breens to the stand.
Ms. Breens, please remember that you are also under oath. Mr. Prosecutor, please continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Miss Breens, will you please state your occupation?
I'm a registered nurse in New York City.
And how have you come to witness the humanitarian crisis in Iraq?
I've been working in Baghdad with the Iraq peace team.
Please give the court an account of what you have seen in Iraq as a result of the U.S. bombings.
I can tell you about Ammar, a 7-year-old boy who I saw in the hospital. He has an emergency chest tube to drain blood as he suffered multiple shell injuries. His mother, Hannah, died in the direct hit to their house. He's from a farming village on the outskirts of Baghdad. Then there is Maureen, 8 years old, also the son of a farmer, but from another area. He's in the bed alongside Ammar and also has a drainage tube. His protrudes from his abdomen. The doctor showed us a plastic bag holding parts of his small intestine, which had to be removed during surgery in order to try to get all of the shrapnel out of his small intestine. His father died in that bombing, and his 6-year-old brother, Ali, was wounded in the head. Shall I go on?
Please.
10-year-old Roussel was wounded in an explosion outside her door. We saw the shrapnel in her chest on the x-ray. She too has a chest tube. Her right hand is fractured. Her father said, Bush said he'd bring democracy to Iraq. This is not democracy, this is terrorism.
I remind the jury that this is not a trial against President George W. Bush. This is a trial against Congressman Vern Ehlers for his support of the Bush administration and the congressman's complicity in crimes against humanity. The previous statement will remain in the court records with this notation. Mr. Prosecutor, continue.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
In the absence of legal counsel for the accused, you may step down, Ms. Breen. Mr. Prosecutor, your next witness.
Thank you. The prosecution calls Mr. Jonathan Steele to the stand.
Mr. Steele, don't forget the oath.
Mr. Steele, you are a reporter for The Guardian, a UK-based newspaper. Is this correct?
That is correct.
And you have been reporting on the war in Iraq from the field, so to speak.
Yes, most recently I have been in Baghdad.
So the jury may have a better understanding of the humanitarian consequences of the military action supported by the accused. Will you please tell the court what you have seen in Baghdad hospitals, specifically the Central Children's Hospital?
Children lying on dirty vinyl mattresses, desperate mothers clutching whimpering infants, harassed doctors signing prescriptions that they barely have time to read.
And at what time in the conflict are you referring to, Mr. Steele?
This would be around the 18th of April, a week after the guns had fallen silent.
And Mr. Steele, to the best of your ability as an objective journalist, please give the court your best sense of the humanitarian situation in these hospitals.
Ali Ismail Abbas, the boy who lost his parents and his arms in an American missile strike, was lucky to be flown to Kuwait. For Iraq's other children, the agony caused by war goes on. Doctors have not been able to keep count of the numbers of injured in the war. After the failure of the city's telephone system, no one was able to coordinate figures. Hospitals cannot contact each other except by sending messengers.
In the current post-war situation, please describe what you were seeing as far as the kinds of injuries.
Many of the injuries are from unexploded ordnances like coalition cluster bombs. At least 6 children were wounded by cluster bombs the week of April 18th. Ali Mustafa is one of those victims. His head is half hidden by a bandage. The 5-year-old was playing with his brother and 2 friends when he picked up an odd round object. It was an unexploded cluster bomb, one of the thousands that lie around Baghdad. It exploded in his hands, blinding him. His legs, scarred with shrapnel, will heal, but Ali Mustafa's sight will never return.
For the benefit of the jury, can you please describe a cluster bomb?
I'm not an expert in munitions, but as I understand it, a cluster bomb is made up of many smaller bombs that get dispersed randomly.
Thank you. Please continue with your description of the hospital.
Even if they escape direct injury from bombing, thousands of Iraqi children are continuing to suffer from the chaos created by war. Fuel shortages and the lack of electricity because of the massive bombings make it hard for hospitals to cope, leaving patients without proper care. The failure to prevent mass looting of the hospitals after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime had also left the hospitals ill-equipped, if equipped at all. Abdul Hamid Al-Sadoun, a doctor at the Central Hospital, told me that they need everything: gauze, cotton, gloves, silk for stitching, needles, x-ray film. Baghdad has 33 hospitals for a population of 5 million, but several are closed because of power shortages or because transport problems prevent staff from getting to work.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. I have no more questions for this witness, Your Honor.
You may step down, Mr. Steele. Mr. Prosecutor, do you have other witnesses to call in this line of investigation?
Yes, Your Honor, but first I'd like to clarify for the jury concerns about munitions. I would like to elaborate on cluster bombs. The information in this letter comes from Mr. Steve Goose, and I submitted as part of the court record. Mr. Goose is a weapons researcher for the New York City-based Human Rights Watch. In part, it says that cluster bombs get their name from the fact that, yes, one large bomb canister actually consists of hundreds of smaller bombs. The type BLU-97, for instance, used by the American forces in this most recent war, contains 202 bomblets, the size of a soft drink can. It is important to note, as Mr. Goose does in this letter, that cluster bombs are not precision weapons. Depending on the delivery system, you might be able to get the actual canister close to a target, but you can't control the bomblets. As Mr. Goose writes, these cluster bombs scatter and spray over a large area about the size of 2 football fields. The U.S. Central Command has made repeated claims that all means would be taken to prevent civilian casualties. However, U.S. Central Command has also acknowledged that U.S. forces, and I quote, have hit areas, neighborhoods with cluster bombs. And that here, I quote again, we had to use them in an urban environment because that was where Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons. Mr. Goose reacts to this position by calling it a disgrace. He writes, these are not the kinds of weapons that you use in urban areas. From a humanitarian perspective, you don't use them because they're very hard to target. They also have a high failure rate. up to 25%, leaving hundreds of bomblets literally lying around like little landmines. I submit this to the court record. Use of such weapons in urban areas disregards the sanctity of innocent lives. International law prohibits militaries from using weapons that indiscriminately target individuals. These are weapons that cannot distinguish between civilians and combatants. The use of cluster bombs in urban areas is a violation of those laws. It is clear that the actions of the accused, Congressman Vern Ehlers, in his support of this war in Iraq have been in violation of international and constitutional law. The greatest horror, however, may be in the very real humanitarian consequences of these practices of unbridled support of aggression. The prosecution now calls our final witness, Mr. Robert Fisk.
Mr. Fisk, that oath applies to you too.
Mr. Fisk, you are a reporter for The Independent and an established contributor with other publications. Is this correct?
Yes.
And you have been working from Iraq during the recent armed conflict, supported by, among others, Congressman Vern Ehlers of Michigan's 3rd Congressional District.
That's correct.
Please describe then, for the jury, some of the details that you have witnessed during this war.
Certainly. Well, the wounded were everywhere. I remember the car salesman who just lost his eye, but whose feet were still dripping from blood. Or the motorist who was shot by American troops near the Rashid Hotel. The 50-year-old female civil servant whose long dark hair spread over a towel she was lying on, and her face and her breasts and her thighs and arms and feet were pockmarked with shrapnel from an American cluster bomb. For the civilians of Baghdad, this is the real, immoral face of war, the direct result of America's clever little probing missions into Baghdad. I'll leave out the description of the flies that have clustered around the wounds in the Kindi emergency rooms, of the blood caked on the sheets, the blood still dripping from the wounds of those I talked to personally. All were civilians, and all wanted to know why they had to suffer. All talked gently and quietly about their pain to me.
Mr. Fisk, these interactions were prior to the fall of Baghdad. Were you escorted by any government officials?
In this case, no. No Iraqi government bus took me to the Kindi hospital, and no doctor knew I was coming. What I saw was not scripted in any way. What I saw was the real human consequences of war with Iraq.
Please continue with your description, Mr. Fisk.
Well, let's start with Mr. Abdulrazak. He's the 40-year-old car salesman who was walking home one morning through a narrow street in the Shab district of Baghdad. That's where the 2 American missiles killed at least 20 civilians in a previous airstrike. When he heard the jet engines of the aircraft, he told me he was going to see his family because the phone exchanges had been bombed and he wanted to make sure that they were okay. He added that there was a family, a husband and his wife, walking in front of him. His words to me, he said, were, I heard this terrible noise, and there was a light, and I knew something had happened to me. And I went to try to help the family in front of me, but they were all gone, literally in pieces. And then I realized I couldn't see properly. The doctor had told me quietly that Mr. Al-Burzak lost his eye, yet he was not aware that he would be half blind for the rest of his life. The doctor also told me that there was nothing they could do, that his eye had been taken out by a piece of shrapnel.
And can you tell us about any other individuals that you spoke with that have been injured as a result of this war?
Yes, indeed. There was also Safa Karim. She's 11, and she's probably dying or dead now. An American bomb fragment struck her in the stomach, and she's bleeding internally, writhing on the bed with a massive bandage on her stomach and a tube down her nose. And somewhat most terrible of all, there was a series of scarves that were tied around each wrist and her ankles to the bed. And I just remember her moaning and thrashing on this bed, fighting pain and imprisonment at the same time. A relative said to me that she's too ill to understand her fate. And she has been given about 10 bottles of medicine, and she vomited them all up because she couldn't keep them down.
Thank you, Mr. Fisk. No more questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Fisk. Mr. Prosecutor, You may now make your closing statements.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, all trials must operate within a finite time. Today, the prosecution has done its best to bring you the details of the war crimes that Mr. Ehlers has made himself an accomplice to because of his support of, one, an illegal war, and two, the means of fighting this war regardless of the humanitarian consequences. And I remind you that Saddam Hussein is not on trial here today. Let it be understood that the prosecution in no way supports his series of crimes against humanity, and we call and support a similar tribunal that will prosecute him and his supporters for their actions before and during this war. But what is important to acknowledge is that the means of fighting this war are in question here. The means of going against the Security Council is a clear violation of international law. Congressman Vern Ehlers' record shows he voted for the use of military action against Iraq. His record clearly demonstrates his complicity in this unlawful act of aggression. And it has also been pointed out that Mr. Ehlers is in violation of the U.S. Constitution, a document that he has sworn to uphold. It may be said that if Mr. Ehlers is guilty, then so is half of Congress. I do not argue with that point. There are clear consequences to this action today, our proceedings. There will be reverberations. Others will be held accountable. Even General Tommy Franks is having a complaint filed against him by Iraqi civilians for war crimes. This is not being made up, ladies and gentlemen. This has been reported by many major newspapers, including the Washington Times. Today, you are being asked to vote on the guilt or innocence of one man, Congressman Vern Ehlers. A vote of guilty means that you realize that Mr. Ehlers' means of supporting this war is in violation of international and constitutional law. A vote of guilty acknowledges that Mr. Ehlers is complicit in crimes against humanity. Finally, in your decision, either for or against Mr. Ehlers, every one of you, every one of us, must take into consideration our own complicity. Are we to be one of the group that refuses to see the facts for what they are? Or do we rather push to be a part of that informed, articulate, general public that Professor Harold has remarked on? The bailiff will pass out pieces of paper and pencils, and on them you can write guilty or not guilty, as charged. As you hold the pencil above the page, ask yourself, to what extent is a citizen responsible for his or her own actions? Does a citizen's conformity with the prevailing social or political code of behavior absolve her of individual responsibility? If a citizen's government, purporting to act for the good of the whole society, enforces a code that conflicts with his own convictions, should he resist? And when? And how? These questions were raised 50 years ago at the Nuremberg trials. Here today, they are of vital importance to ask again. Thank you. It is now for you to decide.